There's been a significant behavioral shift in today's young adults. They're constantly seeking to optimize their self-development and growth. Whether it's their sleeping habits, reading progress, diet tracking, or their mental health, they're always seeking to be more efficient and optimize their experiences, to the point where they'll even spend an average of $300 a month on apps to optimize their learning and development. But the one area that hasn't been optimized is their podcast experience. There's 4 big issues with how podcasts are listened to today. First, there are no podcast summaries to help the listener retain and remember all the stuff that they've learned. Second, you can't save sound bites of key moments or quotes in a podcast. Third, friends have no way to share these sound bites or short clips with one another to discuss their insights and knowledge. And lastly, finding good podcasts that are tailored to you is very difficult and tedious. Discovering new podcasts usually occurs by painstakingly relying on suggestions from friends. In fact, 67% of podcast discovery happens in this way. A quick Google search will pull up countless cases of frustrated podcast listeners who are scouring the web for a solution to all of these problems. And that's to no surprise, considering that there's over 165 million podcast listeners in the USA alone. And in fact, the number of podcast listeners has been increasing at 20% year over year, representing a $1.1 billion market. And because of this huge gap in the podcast industry, we've created Resonance.ai. It allows you to take snippets of podcasts so you can have bite-sized highlights from the podcast that you can save and share with your friends. It allows you to also get more personalized recommendations, and it generates a concise automatic summary of the podcast using machine learning. Now, let's go through a demo of what this will look like in action.
This is the interface for Resonance.ai. We can click on Add to add a podcast file. And by clicking on it, we can see the generated summary. Here we can find information like the title of the podcast and the author. We can also find a BERT extractive summarization here. Let's have a listen.
I must confess, I feel a little bit like Little Miss Sunshine after...
If I wanted to, I could create a clip here by pressing the record button.
All these wonderful presentations. I'm standing here on this empty stage. I have no slides, no music, no PowerPoint, and I'm sitting...
And I can stop the clip there. I can name it whatever I want. Let's see how that sounded.
Presentations. I'm standing here on this empty stage. I have no slides, no music, no PowerPoint.
If it turns out that I like that podcast and I want to find more like it, I can select the podcast and look for similar podcasts as generated by our AI. Here we can see 2 similar podcasts in our current podcast database.
Next, we illustrate the high-level architecture behind our solution. The AI pipeline consisted of data pre-processing, speech-to-text feature, and text summarization. And we developed the user interface in Python. We started by converting YouTube podcasts into MP3 files and storing them in Google Cloud. We used the Google Cloud speech-to-text API to create transcriptions of the podcast. Then we implemented an NLP model to perform extractive summarization on the transcribed text. By finding the embedding vectors for every sentence, we were able to derive the centroid of these vectors. Sentences nearest to the centroid were the ones that best summarize the document and therefore extracted. To find recommendations, we calculate the cosine similarity between each pair of the podcast summary transcriptions. We then implemented a k-nearest neighbors algorithm to retrieve the closest matches. We tested this feature by downloading 4 categories of podcasts that we manually labeled, including sports, art, technology, and education. We validated that the recommendation system produced high accuracy predictions on these results. Unlike others, we differentiate by integrating our product feature into the podcast platform itself, thereby providing an entirely new listening experience. Now, the podcast market is highly fragmented. In the next 5 to 10 years, one platform will be the go-to app for podcasts. And the company that gets there first is the one that focuses on building the best user experience. With our solution today, we believe that Resonance.ai will be leading the charge. Looking to the future, we'll build a library of podcast content on our platform, build the mobile and web app, further train our NLP models, and implement a discussion board section as well.